Our 2005 Cressman Lecturer is Gary Moulton, the Thomas C. Sorenson Professor of American History Emeritus at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and the distinguished editor of the Journals of the Lewis and Clark Expedition. Professor Moulton's fields of specialization include American history, the American West, and historical editing. Gary Moulton received the J. Franklin Jameson Award of the American Historical Association for his editing of the Lewis and Clark journals. He was a consultant for Ken Burns' 1997 film, Lewis and Clark, The Journey of the Core of Discovery, and in 1998 he served as an advisor to the United States Mint on the design of the $1 Sacagawea coin. He was also an advisor for National Geographic's Lewis and Clark IMAX film. I'm afraid we're not going to play any IMAX films tonight, but if there's any room that could do it, I'm sure this is it. In 2001, he received the University of Nebraska's Outstanding Research and Creative Activity Award. He has recently prepared a one-volume abridged edition of the 13-volume Journals of the Lewis and Clark Expedition for the University of Nebraska Press, published in 2003, and this very handsome volume will be available for sale after tonight's lecture, and Professor Moulton will be happy to sign your copies, so please stick around after the lecture. I also want to remind you and urge you to fill out the pink comment sheet if you would like on tonight's event. So please join me in welcoming Gary Moulton, who will be speaking to us about Lewis and Clark's New Look, an exploration of new ways of judging the characters and personalities of the leading figures of the expedition.
Each age rediscovers Lewis and Clark, and we interpret this expedition and these men based on our own times and circumstances. So we come here today, 200 years after the event, to look at Lewis and Clark again and have some sound effects also. Well, my wife and children marvel that I can find some sort of connection to Lewis and Clark in almost anything that I hear or see. And so you might be surprised too that I'm going to tell you about the connections between Lewis and Clark. Well, let's see what we need to do here. Think it'll be okay now? I think we're either off or on, and now we're off. Okay. How is this? I don't think it's on now. I was at another lecture like this one time, and we had a slide projector. I was showing slides, and the slide projector wasn't working right. You know, there are always these technical difficulties. And it had a mind of its own, and I would push the clicker and nothing would happen, or it would just start changing slides. And they would and 2 or 3 times, you know, I would start up and off it would go, and it would be about halfway through my talk, and I was just getting started. And someone from the back of the room, and this person is supposed to be a friend of mine, shouted, "Talk faster!" So who's going to say, "Talk louder"? Should I try that for a while, talking louder? Are we okay now? Ah, I can hear it. I can hear a little feedback now. Okay. This is good. All right. So anyway, where were we? Well, my wife and children marvel that I can make these connections with Lewis and Clark. So you may be surprised that I find a connection between SpiderMan 2, this movie that I saw not long ago. You know, in the 1930s and 40s, there was Superman. That generation needed a superhero to get them through the Depression and through World War II. And here's Superman, this person who is just invulnerable to difficulties. Leap tall buildings, faster than a speeding bullet or speeding train, and and all of these things. It's just the superhero of superheroes. And now our generation comes to reinterpret Lewis and Clark at the very time we have Spider-Man 2, who has these doubts, who's not sure of himself, who even wants to reject his superpowers, even does reject them for a time. And so each age, develops its superheroes after its own climate and attitudes and circumstances. Well, we've done something of the same with Lewis and Clark. Earlier generations saw them as these superheroes who could bestride the continent and seemed to be invulnerable to the sort of human activities and foibles that most of us face day to day. They were come back from this expedition as these great heroes, and each generation then just raised them higher and higher. 100 years ago in 1904 and 1905, the emphasis in St. Louis was on the Louisiana Purchase. Now out here in 1905, of course, you got it right and did Lewis and Clark, but back in 1904 in St. Louis, it was all about the Louisiana Purchase. And here the Louisiana Purchase in this bicentennial is largely ignored, and we're talking about Lewis and Clark. They've just loomed larger and larger. Yet our generation, who's worried about multiculturalism, who's concerned about the native peoples, who's worried about their own psychological and emotional and family problems, has sort of laid these sort of things on Lewis and Clark. And so I want to talk about these sort of changes in the way we view Lewis and Clark in the 20th and the 21st century. First, a little bit about these individuals, and we'll look at Meriwether Lewis first. He was born in 1774 in Virginia, near Charlottesville, Virginia, the home of Thomas Jefferson, who had his great estate there at Monticello. And he grew up sort of in the shadows of Monticello, and Jefferson knew him as a young man, a child growing up, and watched him and was quite taken with this young man, the successes he had in his life and the sort of spirit that he showed. His father died during the Revolutionary War, so he was raised mostly by his mother and then a stepfather who took them off to Georgia for a time, but then he came back to Virginia as a young man to get his education. He had a good education by the standards of his time. He, though, more was interested in being out in the woods. He loved these woody haunts. He would go out by himself. He was sort of a loner, and he loved to go out and be with nature, and he became something of a naturalist. He had this natural inclination toward being a naturalist. His mother was a renowned herbalist, and people from all around the region would come to her to get simple potions for their ailments and their sicknesses, and he learned those sort of things. And during the expedition, he would a lot of times mix up some sort of decoction for the ailing members of the Lewis and Clark party. So Lewis grew up in this environment of a love of nature and being outside and being alone. But he found very quickly that he wanted to find a real career in military service. Very early then he went off into military service, but quickly got into trouble. He seemed to be unsuited for the reins of military discipline in some ways because he was called up to a court-martial for speaking back to a superior officer. Maybe he had been drinking too much. He wrote home to his mother one time and said, "There are mountains of beef and gallons of beer." He seemed to like this army life and the sort of excesses maybe that he could be involved in military life. But here he had spoken back to a superior officer and was called down to a court-martial. Now, he was acquitted of any charges against him, so he got out of that. But maybe some of the superior officers thought he needed time with a seasoned soldier, someone who could guide his rambunctiousness and point his energies to something more favorable. So he was put with a crack rifle squad, a rifle team led by an officer who'd been in the ranks for some time, a man named William Clark. William Clark and Lewis met in 1796, sometime in the early months then. We don't really know too much about their meeting, how they came together, what sort of discussions they had, what brought a bond between them that would never separate, that would keep them close not only in the expedition, but throughout their lives. Somehow they clicked. They bonded during these few months, and though they would write occasionally over the years and maybe see one another at least one other time, pretty much they separated out of that after that time, but they never lost this high regard for one another. Lewis then went on to other military service. Now, Lewis was never a frontline officer. He was never one to face down enemy fire. He never took up arms against Native Americans, never fought Indians. He was more an aide-de-camp. He ran dispatches around the country, payroll receipts. He was more an administrative officer and never really a frontline Army officer who faced down enemy fire. Jefferson had been watching him during these years and had become somewhat convinced that this was the young man who he could use in service to him in the White House. When Jefferson came into the presidency in 1801, he called Lewis from his military service, and now a captain in the regular army, to come to the White House and be his private secretary. Now that's what they called him at that time, but Lewis was not going to be a scribe to write out letters for the president. President Jefferson wrote all his own letters in his own hand. And the man who could write the Declaration of Independence didn't need someone writing speeches and dispatches for him. So Jefferson's call to Lewis was more to be an aide-de-camp to him, a chief of staff, more than a scribe to take notes. Now here at this point is where we get the first change in our view of Lewis. And this is what has only occurred in the last 10 or 15 years because of some new documents that were discovered. Up until this time, people had always considered that Lewis was called from his military service by Jefferson to prepare him for the Western expedition. But just a few years ago, documents were discovered in Lewis's hand that revealed another motive for his calling. It was a list of the officer corps, that is, the members of the military staff who were the chief and principal officers in the military service, and beside each name was listed cryptic letters that revealed their political affiliations. Now remember that Jefferson has come into the presidency as the first one out of the established party of Washington and Hamilton and Adams, the Federalist Party. He's a Democratic Republican. Now these men of the Revolutionary era, the Jefferson, Washington, Adams, they knew their history, and they knew that over time these new endeavors in political revolutions as the United States was created had oftentimes fallen apart because of coups d'etats. Some general, some soldier, some Napoleon who wanted to push through and come to the top. So Jefferson was using Lewis's knowledge of the political affiliations of the officers' corps to block anyone who might have ambitions to overturn this new Democratic Republican revolution, the Revolution of 1800, the election of Thomas Jefferson. So it gave a whole new complex to Lewis's arrival at the White House. And it wasn't the Western expedition. In fact, Jefferson did not start thinking again about a Western expedition until 1802, a year into his presidency. He read a book by Alexander Mackenzie, a Canadian who worked for the Northwest Fur Company and who had just made a transcontinental expedition in Canada. And it was one of these fire bell in the night experiences for Jefferson. It was a threat to the control of the whole interior of the United States and the Pacific Northwest. Who is going to control this vast area? If it's the British and the Canadians, then the United States was in trouble, and it reignited an interest that had lain dormant for some time for Western exploration. And who better to do it than a young man he had confidence in? Certainly hadn't had frontline military duty, but he was a good administrator. He had led men throughout the Northwest. He had had negotiations with American Indian tribes. He was confident of this young man's ability. Plus, he had the sort of scientific knowledge that Jefferson knew would be important because of his basic knowledge of the terrain and the environment of the eastern coast. When he moved west, he would know how to identify new environmental zones and botanical specimens and zoological species. So he knew Lewis could take on this job, and he had confidence in him. So Lewis now became the captain not only of the regular military, but he would become a captain of a corps of discovery. And Jefferson would send him out on this expedition. Now, Jefferson had confidence in Lewis in these areas I've talked about, his scientific training, his leadership abilities, but he also had confidence in him as a writer, a recorder, a literary ability that he saw in Lewis. And he wanted Lewis not only to do these things, but then come back and report to the nation about what he had seen, what he had observed, what sort of events had happened on the trip, and about this new Louisiana territory and the lands beyond it in the Pacific Northwest. What are these areas like? And how well will they fit in with our culture and our own inclinations and our looks toward the future? So he was confident in Lewis in this area as well. But here Lewis begins to fail Jefferson almost immediately. And let's skip forward to when he takes up the expedition and begins to write his first lines in a little journal he was keeping in August of 1803 as he left Pittsburgh and went down the Ohio. And it's a spotty journal at best. And then he reaches Louisville, Kentucky in October, and he reaches out his hand and shakes hand with William Clark, and it becomes the Lewis and Clark expedition. And he hands that notebook over to William Clark. And he begins to fail almost immediately in one of the tasks set for him, to keep a record of the expedition. And William Clark then is going to be the writer for the rest of the period down the Ohio and up the Mississippi. And when they take off on the trip, May 14, 1804, Lewis again seems to not take up Jefferson's desire to have a firm written record, an account of the expedition in a sort of a solid, consistent way. It's not Lewis who's writing every day about the occurrences of the party. It's Clark. Clark, the constant journal keeper, who only missed 10 days during the whole of the trip and then made those up later. One of the members of the party, Sergeant John Ordway, was even better. He wrote an entry for every one of the 863 days they were out. Jefferson's idea that Lewis would be the principal writer or record keeper was lost to Lewis almost entirely. From May 14, 1804, when they set out on the expedition, till April the 7th, 1805, a year in time, Lewis wrote not a single word in a journal. Now, he may have been doing some other writing during this period, certain scientific notes he was keeping separately, but we simply don't have those, and we have no record of daily journal keeping. And there are other great gaps in his writing. He stops in August of 1805 and doesn't write again until January of 1806, except for spotty entries. And again, we have to wonder what is going on with Lewis. In some of these times, we can find excuses or reasons for him not writing. Lewis and Clark were sharing their duties. Maybe Clark was going to be the writer of daily events during the first part of the trip when they were along very well-known terrain, and Lewis would be doing the scientific work. Perhaps there was some sharing here, but we simply can't explain these great gaps in his writing. Or can we? Some people would say we can. We can explain them because Lewis was having psychological difficulties. Now, people who accept the fact that he committed suicide 3 years after the expedition are always looking back to periods during the expedition to find instances that will explain that suicide. And his lack of writing during great periods of time are some of the easiest things to look for. Besides these great gaps in his writing, there's only one other instance that we can look at in the journals themselves that seem to talk to us about these inner struggles that Lewis may have been having. On his 31st birthday, August the 18th, 1805, he writes this introspective passage. Nowhere else in the journals is anything like this discovered. The journals were journals. They were just that. They were professional writings of military men on a mission for the president. They aren't diaries that reveal their inner thoughts and struggles. No one wrote, "I dreamed of Sacagawea last night" in their journals. They simply are saying, "We did this, we did that, we proceeded on." But on August the 18th, Lewis takes up his pen and begins to remonstrate against himself. I haven't done as much as I should have done. I haven't succeeded the way I thought I would have succeeded. I could have been a contender, he seems to be saying. And we wonder about a person who would do this. Here's a captain in the Army. Here's a person who's been private secretary to the President of the United States. Here's a person who's on the first official government expedition into the American West. It seems like he's succeeded greatly, yet he's not sure of himself. If you read the first part of the passage, you think Lewis really does have problems. He's unsure of himself. He has inner struggles. He's not content. What's wrong with this person? Doesn't he understand himself even? But if you read the second part of the passage, he says, "But I dashed those gloomy thoughts from my mind and endeavored to go on and do better." That's the positive note that I see in Lewis. And I think people who search in the journals for answers to a sort of a psychological state or a dissolution of Lewis are not going to find it there in the journals too well. And people like Stephen Ambrose and Ken Burns, people who have examined Lewis's life, talk now about a bipolar disorder. Someone who's up one day and down the next. Maybe he's energized and vital, and he's working hard, and he's ambitious, and he's writing constantly. When Lewis did write, he wrote lengthily, and he wrote poetically. Some of his passages just ring with passion. And yet at other points, he's not writing at all. Now he's in this deep blue funk. And people like Ambrose and Ken Burns and other writers have talked about these psychological and emotional difficulties. I just don't know. I don't feel comfortable with it, but I know things are troubling here, but I'm not sure it's evident on the expedition. Maybe he was able to cloud these things or cover them up. There's no one writing among any of the other journalists about difficulties with Lewis. Now, this was not an age that was going to write about his psychological, emotional problems. But they might have noticed a certain sickness or a certain removal of him. And Clark may have written about some of these sort of things that they would have seen that would have been apparent on the surface. And no one speaks to that at all. After the trip, something else occurs. Now he gets into all sorts of problems. Well, let's begin. Let's catalog these problems and see what they add up to, if they're the suicide. And these are the things that people now are concentrating on. Lewis's psychological and emotional difficulties. First of all, he has a backstabbing administrative assistant who's firing off nasty letters to Washington and getting Lewis in trouble. It's not the administration of Thomas Jefferson now. There's a new administration. His friends are out of office. And although he's a governor in a high position, he's got to answer to folks in Washington. He sent a group of Army officers and other people up the Missouri River to return an Indian chief. And the cost has been extravagant to get this Indian chief back home. And Lewis sends in the bill for it, and some clerk in the War Department stamps reject on it and sends it back. And Lewis is personally responsible for it. Personally responsible for that government debt. He's also in trouble financially himself. He's overextended himself in personal investment. He's working in the dot-com industry of his age. He's invested in the fur trade operation and losing money. And now he's in debt publicly and privately, and creditors are pressing in. He begins to drink heavily. He's probably using drugs. He was the doctor, the physician on the expedition. And he's got the medicine chest there he's opened up. And what's his drug of choice? Laudanum. Laudanum is a mixture of opium and alcohol. It was the favorite drug of Victorian women. No wonder they were swooning all the time. Opium. So Lewis now is engaged in drinking, taking drugs. He's got a backstabbing administrative assistant. He's distanced himself from Jefferson, his mentor. Jefferson is writing him critical letters saying, "Why aren't you finishing up that book that you promised? I'm in debt to all my friends," who say, "Where is that book?" He's like a major professor, and I know about that work, pressing that student, "Get that chapter to me next week." Jefferson says, "Why haven't you written me?" So Lewis has quit writing Jefferson. He feels this pressure. He's distanced himself from William Clark. He came back to St. Louis having tried to find a wife, but was unlucky in love. Maybe the women saw him and thought there was something in his character that didn't quite work. You would have thought he would have been a catch of the season, yet he came back a bachelor. Maybe he couldn't find a woman he could really connect with. He kept writing about this woman and that woman, yet he came back a bachelor. And the old bachelor pad he and Clark were living in was not going to be suitable anymore because Clark came back with a new bride, Julia Hancock of Fincastle, Virginia. And I'm sure when she moved into that apartment and Lewis came to get in there too, she said, "Well, I don't think this is going to work," and said, "Maybe you better move along and my new husband and I will live here." She's sort of the Yoko Ono of Lewis and Clark. So now he is separated from Clark and from Jefferson. He's alcohol and medications. And all of these things are coming down on him, and it's this great public debt. And he has to go back to Washington, D.C. and try to straighten out his affairs. 3 years after the expedition, he has not written a single word. On the way back, he stops at an inn in Tennessee, a little inn along the Natchez Trace, and he spends the night there, and that's when he does the deed. He commits suicide. Now, there are some people who believe he was murdered for the money that he had or for some other conspiratorial reason, but the people I respect most as historians and researchers on this accept that he committed suicide. Stephen Ambrose, Ken Burns, Jim Rhonda, John Allen, I could just go right on down the list, who are convinced that he committed suicide. Perhaps all of these things taken together don't really add up to suicide. There are some people who have these things happen to them and they energize them and they decide to go on and do better. But I believe Lewis couldn't cope and committed suicide. The two people who knew him best accepted it immediately. Jefferson later wrote a little biographical sketch of Lewis and said the nearer branches of his family were caught up in these hypochondric affections. And by that he meant some sort of psychological disorders. And you have to ask yourself, if Jefferson knew this, why did he put him off on this expedition? Jefferson said the family knew how to control it, and Lewis did too. And on the expedition, he didn't suffer from these things, but they came back to haunt him after the expedition. Clark, who was on his own trip when Lewis committed suicide, wrote in his journal, I fear, oh I fear, the weight of his mind has overcome him. And he never deviated from that belief. So the men who knew him best, his closest friends, accepted it, and I accept it today. This thing about the murder keeps coming up from time to time, but I will stick with suicide until I see better evidence to the contrary. And what about his friend? His co-commander on the trip, William Clark, who now was faced with the task of writing up a report to the nation that Lewis had never done. He did probably what Lewis should have done. He went out and hired a ghostwriter to help him with it. And he completed the job through the work of this ghostwriter in a few years later, and it was published and became the first report to the nation. William Clark, that constant companion, that reliable officer who was always there writing in his journal, doing his surveying, doing his map making, taking care of the details of day-to-day drudgery of the Lewis and Clark expedition. What about him? He doesn't seem to suffer from these difficulties of Lewis. But Clark has another aspect of his life and character that historians and researchers have begun to investigate. Oh, it's not during the expedition or immediately after, but within a few years, letters to his brother seem to talk about a new relationship in his life. And it's a relationship with one of the members of the party from the trip, York, his black slave. Now, these letters were discovered, a stash of about 47 letters that Clark had written his older brother Jonathan back in Louisville, Kentucky, after the expedition. And these were unknown to us until the trunk was opened up in Louisville, and there they were. The family who had the proprietary rights to them put them away in a safety deposit box for several years, trying to decide what to do with them, but eventually showed them to a historian at the Filson Historical Society in Louisville, and he was amazed at what he was reading. And they eventually turned these over to that historical society, and now a book called Dear Brother has been published telling about those letters. They're a wonderful set of letters, and Clark opens his heart to his older brother. And we see a Clark that we hadn't known before. Well, who is this William Clark? He was born in 1770. He was 4 years older than Lewis. He came from a distinguished military family. George Rogers Clark, his older brother, was someone who had had this illustrious career in the Revolutionary War, who had saved the West, that is, the West of that day, for the United States and helped the Revolution come about and the United States gain its independence. Other brothers had also served in the Revolutionary War, and I can just see young Billy Clark sitting there around the family hearth and hearing stories of his illustrious brother's careers and wanting a military career for himself. And pretty quickly he jumped into that. They moved from Virginia to Kentucky when he was a teenager, and then he went into military service himself. And he was the superior officer that Lewis went to sort of learn the ropes and get him straightened out. But Clark had to turn from that military career because his brother George Rogers was in trouble financially and emotionally, and he too was drinking heavily like Lewis would do later. And so Clark went home to be a caregiver, not only to his parents, but to his older brother. And here we see a part of William Clark that sort of defines his character. He was the 9th of 10 children, and there were no biographies out of William Clark until just this last year, and now there's 2 out and there's 1 more coming, so we've had a flood of new William Clark information. And people talk about being the 9th of 10 children, how you have to learn to be an accommodationist, how you have to learn to compromise and give in and care for people as they age and be ready to do these sort of caregiving things like William Clark would do. So here was this person then that would go home, would resign his commission, move out of a promising career to care for his older brother. And while he's waiting there for things to happen in his life and wondering what's going to happen with him, while he's caring for George Rogers, he gets a letter from Meriwether Lewis inviting him to join him on this historic mission. And of course, he immediately accepts it and says, I will join you heart and hand on this mission. And he's going to leave home and leave these people and take up this job as the co-commander of the Lewis and Clark expedition. But in truth, his service was not as co-commander. Because of some snafu in the War Department, he was only given a lieutenant's commission. And William Clark and Lewis hid this back from the men, and he always signed himself Captain William Clark, captain of a corps of discovery. So he was not really a captain in the Army, he was only a lieutenant. Lewis and Clark never seemed to call attention to this fact. They served during the whole of the trip as co-commanders. And Clark never seemed to feel any sort of secondary role to Lewis. The truth is, he only spoke of that lower rank one time in all his life, as far as we know. He got a letter from this editor, this ghostwriter, who was doing his work and said, explain to me your position relative to Captain Lewis. And Clark wrote back and said it was equal in every instance. He was sure of himself in this regard, but during the expedition and afterwards, he never breathed a word about it. So this constant, reliable, dependable individual, William Clark. During the expedition, he had his black slave with him, a man named York. York was about Clark's age. We're not sure when he was born. York is the only name we have for him. He doesn't have a last name or another name. York's all we know. He may have been the boyhood companion of William Clark. That's the way it occurred in the South sometimes. When a young child was born, they would have one of the slaves, young children, to be sort of their playmate in these distances from other neighbors. And so York may have grown up as the boyhood companion of William Clark. And when he's going to leave here on the trip, he takes York along with him. He was his body servant. But if you read the journals of Lewis and Clark, you get a sense of York as just one of the members of the party, a regular guy. He was able to hunt with a rifle. Virginia and Kentucky slaves would never have been able to do that. He seemed to have participated in all the regular activities of the Corps of Discovery. On the Oregon coast out here, when they were ready to decide whether they were going to camp and have their wintering fort in either Washington or Oregon, and votes were taken, York was allowed to vote also, and his decision was recorded right there in the journals. So people who read the journals of Lewis and Clark and didn't know about these later letters had this vision of York as a regular guy, a regular member of the Corps of Discovery. And then these letters were found. And it gave us a whole new picture of William Clark. William Clark, the harsh slave master. He did not set York free after the expedition. He valued his labor and he needed his work too much. Clark, this good man, turns into something else in these letters to his brother Jonathan. He says at one point, York is acting uppity, and if he doesn't straighten up, I'm going to send him to you. and you put him under a harsh slave master, and then he'll see how good he has it with me. He says on another occasion, York is complaining. He wants to come back to Kentucky to be with his wife and family. Imagine that. He says, I wish he would quit complaining. I beat him last week and he's better for it. I put him in jail because he was acting insolent. If he doesn't straighten up, I'm going to sell him down the river to New Orleans. That is the most fearful thing that any slave could face. Going to New Orleans to be put on the open slave market. And Lord knows what would happen to you, who your master would be, what sort of work you would be put to, what would happen to you, and how distant and separated you would be from all those that you loved and cherished. And maybe Clark was a harsh master at this point, but better to stay with him than being sold on the open slave market. Here's a William Clark we could not conceive of, a harsh slave master. Eventually, Clark gave York his freedom, although that's even suspect in a way. We know that he did set him up in a wagon operation, and York spent time carrying goods back and forth, but somehow he failed at that too, and then he disappears from history, and we just don't know what came of him. There's legends that he may have gone into the interior of the United States. He seemed to have been admired by the Native American tribes that he was meeting. Oftentimes he was respected and admired above Lewis and Clark because of his black skin and his different facial characteristics and his hair contexture. All of these things seemed to give him a certain spirit that Native Americans hadn't seen before. And so there were legends about York going to live with Native Americans. I doubt that. I think a more prosaic story probably occurred. He just got lost to history, and these legends grew up around him. I think Stephen Ambrose had it right when he said, if the slavery institution could corrupt a good man like William Clark, then we know how corrupt it actually was. We can't judge him from our 21st century vantage point with our own ideas about human relationships and what you ought to do for a person who served so gallantly and faithfully on a trip, and now put him back to his former diminished status. We can hardly imagine someone doing this, but we can't judge Clark. We have to understand from the context of his own times. But other persons were able to overcome those times and free their slaves and do something different. Clark needed York's work. He needed the income he could get out of York, and he simply wasn't able to reject that. Jefferson did not free his slaves either. Washington did, Jefferson didn't. Some people were too dependent, became too dependent on the labor, the work, the income from their slaves, and Clark was that person. So although we can't judge him by our own standards, we also have to look at the standards of the time and say that Clark didn't meet up to them entirely either. So there you are, Meriwether Lewis, this anguished, inner struggled, psychologically dependent individual on alcohol and drugs and with deep emotional problems. And here's Clark, a harsh slave master. We're bringing the context of our own time onto these people. And I think we will continue to reinterpret Lewis and Clark as persons, as characters, but we don't need to entirely envelop them in our own problems, in our own times, but understand they had their weaknesses and difficulties too, and still respect them for what they were able to do on the expedition, and understand that they too had difficulties in their lives, and this was a way that they found to cope, or a way that they found that they could not cope with those things. So Lewis and Clark remain, for me, heroes of another age, another time that doesn't always fit our own conceptions of what they should be. But nevertheless, their accomplishments were incredible, and I respect them for that. And I look forward to new interpretations and new looks at Lewis and Clark over the years. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Steve.
Well, I'm sure you have lots of questions. That was a fascinating lecture. Please.
Yes, sir.
Do any of the original Harpers Ferry rifles exist today, or the 15?
The question is about the Harpers Ferry rifle, the 1803 rifle that Lewis went down to Harpers Ferry, today West Virginia, to get. There were 15 of them, like you say. There is no documented absolute record that any of them exist. A few years ago, an individual published an article in American Rifleman believing that he had portions of one of the weapons from Harpers Ferry. Now, this is very doubtful, I think, because a controversy still rages over what that weapon actually was. There's a school of thought that this was a brand new rifle. That is, a rifle that was just being created at Harpers Ferry, and it was going to be the standard weapon of the new Army. You know, when I went in, I was issued an M1. Well, this was the M1 of its day. It was going to be the new rifle of the Army. But others say, no, it was a retrofitted 1792 rifle. So is it a prototype of the new rifle to come that would be the standard issue until the 1820s, or is it a retrofitted older rifle made for Lewis? And now we simply don't know. The person who thought he had one that was like the 1803. So those people who pushed for the 1792 retrofitted rifle would say certainly he didn't have it. So that debate will continue, but I would say at this point there is none. There are none of the rifles available today. Yes, sir.
John Baptiste ever married?
John Baptiste Charbonneau, who Lewis and Clark called Pomp or Pompey on the expedition, as far as we know, he never did marry. He had an incredible career, but as far as we know, he didn't marry. There's no record of it. He became quite well known out in California, and there was an obituary written of him after his death. There was no mention of any marriage or children. So we simply don't know, but it's very unlikely. I think some of his companions in California, some of the people who knew him might have spoke of that at the time of his death. Yes, ma'am. The question is, Jean-Baptiste buried in Oregon? Yes, he was. There's a legend that has him buried in Wyoming, and it goes back to these claims of where Sacagawea was, where she died and was buried. And there's quite a claim that she was, that she lived into the 1880s, almost into being 100 years old, and died on the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming, and John Baptiste was with her and buried there by her side. And if you drive through Lander, Wyoming, you'll see large tombstone there with her name on it and Jean Baptiste's name on it. But the truth is he did die in Oregon in 1860. Well, Lewis and Clark aren't open 24/7 actually, but I'm going to stick around a little while longer, be happy to sign books, and be happy to talk with any of you more about Lewis and Clark. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you, Steve, for this evening.